Bruce in Indiana. This is a double Indiana day at Mike and Bruce. Please explain 1 Corinthians 15:11. Good to see you, Bruce, by the way. 1 Corinthians 15:11. Therefore, whether it were I or they, so we preach, and so ye believed. Of course, obviously, we will need a little bit of context. So let's jump back. That was verse 11. Let's jump back to I don't know, verse, I'm going to guess 8. So he's speaking of the resurrection. Last seen of me, I'm least of the apostles. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace, which was bestowed upon me, was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I. The grace of God was with me. Okay, so he's talking about, he's not one of them, I guess you could say, not one of the early ones, not one of those apostles. He rather persecuted the church of God, but God's grace came, made him to be what he is, and his grace was bestowed upon me, not in vain. I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I. And he's, I don't know, can you say bragging a little bit? But I think it's okay to brag in this case, and because he's laying an argument that requires it. I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was in me. Therefore, whether it were I, Paul, or they, the apostles, so we preach, and so ye believed. Okay, we preach here, we preach what? The argument is we preach the resurrection. And so it goes on now, if Christ be preached that he rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no resurrection from the dead? And the resurrection is what he's trying to prove to be the case here. And the resurrection is the general resurrection, not the resurrection of Christ. He's saying, hey, those apostles preached the resurrection of Christ. I preach the resurrection of Christ. Maybe I preached it more than they preached the resurrection of Christ. And you believe in the resurrection of Christ. But now some of you who believe in the resurrection of Christ are saying that there is no general resurrection in the end. What's up with that? That's where I think this passage is going. Now, to look at this, the question on this passage, 1 Corinthians 15:11, please explain. Bruce says, I know many people use this verse to claim Paul and the 12 preach the same thing. I don't believe that's the case. Well, I agree with you ultimately. Ultimately and theologically, I completely agree with you. Because I don't think here that, I'm going to say this a little bit differently. I do not think that he's saying, I, Paul, and those apostles preach the same thing. We have the same message, or as I've been saying, or as I would say if we were talking about our rightly divided gospel series, I don't think he's saying the apostles preach the same gospel that I preach. So I agree with you there. I don't believe that's the case either. But I do think that here Paul is saying they preach the resurrection, I preach the resurrection. Both of our gospels are dependent upon the resurrection. In fact, both of our gospels, the kingdom gospel and the grace gospel, are both dependent upon the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he starts earlier in that passage about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then hones in on the resurrection. So did Peter preach the resurrection? Absolutely. We could find a lot of examples about that. Did the apostles preach yeah, it's certainly an apostolic message or a kingdom message is the resurrection of the Messiah. The same, does Paul preach it in the grace gospel? Yes. And this is where, and I've touched on this a few times in our Rightly Divided Gospel series, this is where we have to be careful, because just because something mentions the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ does not mean that it's talking about the grace gospel. It could be talking about the kingdom gospel, because the kingdom gospel had to, was dependent upon, after the rejection of the king, the resurrection of the king, and the second offer. You might argue the original offer if we were going to get real fine in our offerings, but so there is this. You are right. People will use this verse to claim that Paul and the 12 preach the same thing. The problem is they are equating teaching of the resurrection with the grace gospel. I think therein is the problem. So this verse does, if you just want to be, most myopic about it, this verse does teach that Paul and the 12 both taught the resurrection. Does that mean they taught the same thing? No. And I agree with you on that. And because I have never had that question asked in that way, I am going to ring the bell, Bruce. This is going to get in the bell ringing playlist. First time ever questions. And that's a fun playlist to share around.